Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Eye on Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very delighted today to have Dr. David Stenner, our guest speaker. Before I pass the floor to him, a brief introduction, and please forgive my voice. I'm struggling with fighting a kind of a cold. So here it goes. So Dr. David Stenner is an associate professor in the Department of History at Christopher Newport University with a research focus on the decolonization of the Arab world. He is currently writing a people's history of World War II in North Africa, which has been supported by a John W. Kluge Fellowship from the Library of Congress. He is the author of Globalizing Morocco, Transnational Activism and the Post-Colonial State from Stanford University Press in 2019. Furthermore, he has published articles in the Journal of Global History, the Journal of North African Studies, Cold War History, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and the Journal of Middle East Women Studies. Thank you very much, Dr. Stenner, for being here. We appreciate it. Now the floor is up to you.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. I would like to thank the African Studies Center at MSU for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about my own work. As many of you are probably well aware, it's very rare as a North Africanist to speak at an African Studies Center, just as African studies folks rarely, there's a little crossover to North Africa. Regrettably, we're usually in the Middle East corner of academia. So I really like this opportunity to branch out a little bit. My talk today is, as mentioned, about the book I published a little bit ago. It's going to be roughly 45 minutes long, and I know it's lunchtime, and I hope to make it as lively as possible to keep you all awake throughout. Let's hope that the PowerPoint works. Here we go. First up, Morocco. What we need to know for our sake, for the sake of this presentation, is that Morocco was a colony of France predominantly. We see it in the lower right corner. It was a kingdom, but it was protected by the French. There was a northern strip along the Mediterranean in the Rif Mountains that was a Spanish protectorate, and there was the international city of Tangier, which was governed by a committee of control. The protectorates begin in 1912. Morocco obtains its independence in 1956. And our story begins in 1942, 1943. That is towards the end of the Second World War, when the two Moroccan independence manifestos are published, and we'll end about 2 years after Moroccan independence. The main protagonists of this story are, on the one hand, the two nationalist parties, Hizb al-Istiqlal, established in December 43 in French Morocco, by far the largest grassroots anti-colonial movement in Morocco. On the eve of independence, we don't know exact numbers, but they had several 100,000 active members. And in the Spanish zone, Hizb al-Islah al-Watani, the Party of National Reform, established in 1936. These are independent organizations, but as we will see in a minute, they worked very closely, hand in hand, throughout the independence struggle. Also, the monarch of Morocco is an important person in this narrative. Sultan Mohammed bin Yusuf, who after independence renames himself King Mohammed V. So I hope it doesn't cause any confusion when I suddenly switch the title that I used to refer to him towards the end of the lecture. The basic questions that guided my research were as follows. First, how did Morocco obtain its independence from France and Spain in March 1956? Second, why did Morocco become an authoritarian monarchy following the end of colonial rule rather than either democracy or one-party dictatorship? And how did the legacy of the Moroccan independence struggle shape the country's foreign policy during the Cold War? Now, in order to answer that, I utilize social network analysis. And I apologize for dumping this a little bit obscure-looking visualization right at the beginning, but it shows you the structure of the social network of foreign supporters that the Moroccan nationalists created during the 1940s and 1950s in order to use their foreign supporters to create international pressure on France to relinquish their protectorate. And my argument is that they did so quite successfully, that this is one of the factors leading to the end of French colonial and then Spanish colonial rule in Morocco, but that after independence, the king managed to co-opt the central nodes within this network, thereby strengthening his position, weakening the nationalist parties, and establishing the authoritarian monarchy that runs the country until today. I know these graphs are still a bit difficult to decipher, but we'll get back to them at the very end, and I promise you they'll make more sense then. Just some basic concepts from social network analysis that I'll be using. One is the idea of a broker. That's an individual that bridges a structural gap within a network. Here it's highlighted, nodes C and D. They are brokers if they were absent from these networks. The two subgroups or cliques on the right and the left would no longer be able to communicate. And as brokers, they acquire a particular amount of social capital, which Ronald Byrd once defined as, in brokerage, social capital is created by bridge relations that coordinate across groups with complementary resources, knowledge, and practice. Network bridges are defined by the lack of third parties. And to just delve a little bit deeper into what social capital is, since it's a term I'll be using throughout this presentation, one definition by James Coleman is, unlike other forms of capital, social capital inheres in the structure of relations between actors and among actors. It is not lodged either in the actors themselves or in physical implements of production. And Nan Lin defined it as, or wrote, being in a node of a network directly and indirectly provides potential access to other nodes, actors in the social network. Resources embedded in these nodes become the ego's social capital. Social capital reflects more than the mere personal resources of those nodes in the network. Since individual actors may be embedded in hierarchical structures and other networks, they bring to bear resources embedded in the positions of these hierarchies as well. In other words, I don't think about a social network as some sort of like two-dimensional, freely floating social structure, but rather as embedded in, commonly understood social hierarchies of class, race, gender, etc. And that these quote unquote external factors obviously impact the functioning of the network and the actors within it. All right, let's actually talk about the story itself. It begins with the landing of the Allied troops during the Second World War, called Operation Torch. Within a few days, the US Army defeats the French, which were loyal to the Vichy regime, and quote unquote liberates North Africa. And this reinvigorates the Moroccan nationalist movement. In the words of a prominent nationalist, quote, "We knew that we had to have foreign support if we were to succeed. Therefore, we thought it proper to declare before the opinion of the world our grievances and our demands." Influential in this regard was the establishment of the Arab League in Cairo, with united those at least nominally sovereign Arab states in an intergovernmental organization to advocate on the international stage for Arab interests. And of course, for the Moroccans as colonial subjects, appealing to the Arab League and seemed like a great idea in the hope that Arab diplomats would use their power to advocate for Moroccan independence. The nationalists in Spanish Morocco managed to convince the Spanish High Commissioner, for a range of complicated reasons, which we can talk about in the Q&A, to send a Moroccan delegation to Cairo to the Cultural Committee of the Arab League. And it is led by Mohammed Ben Aboud and Mohammed Al-Fasi Al-Halfawi. Upon their arrival, the Egyptian media talks about them here. They're being received by Egyptian King Farouk himself. So it was a huge PR success. During his speech before the Arab League, Mohammed Ben Aboud declared, "Morocco has great hope in solving its colonial problems, and it relies upon itself and the Arab League regarding this." In a letter to his family back home, Ben Aboud wrote, "The Arab officials assign great importance to our cause, which makes us very optimistic." One of the reasons for optimism was the first Secretary General of the Arab League, Abderrahman Azam Basha, who was really personally dedicated to Pan-Arabism and specifically to the rights of the Arab peoples of North Africa. He made sure that their issues, at least sometimes, showed up on the agenda of the Arab League. And he also was a close friend to the Moroccan nationalists who arrived and provided them with contacts and insights to the higher circles of the who's who of the Arab world. Together with Tunisian and Algerian nationalists who also were in Cairo, the Moroccans established Maktab al-Maghreb al-Arabi, the Arab Maghreb office, which became the official representation of the North African nationalist movements in Cairo, advocating for their causes before the Arab public and among mainly Egyptians, but also in general Arab politicians. They usually held tea parties to which they invited prominent members. They didn't really have a newsletter that they published on a regular basis, little pamphlets and books about the history of Morocco, to inform the Egyptian public about, what is Morocco, what's going on there, and what the Egyptians should do to support it. And this was quite successful at creating a lot of, buzz around the Moroccan question. Some of the many prominent Arabs that sometimes attended events by Maktab al-Maghreb were, for example, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, a Palestinian leader who nowadays, to put it politely, is seen as a nefarious character, but back then held a lot of prestige in Arab nationalist circles. The biggest success that the Moroccans had while in Egypt was the escape of Ibn Abd al-Karim al-Khattabi. Now, Abd al-Karim al-Khattabi was a hero in the Islamic world. He had fought a successful campaign against the Spanish colonizers from 1920 until 1926 in the northern Rif Mountains. He'd been very successful. Only when the French joined the fray in 25 did these two colonial armies together manage to defeat him. Now, he wasn't just your run-of-the-mill rebel, but he actually established a modern proto-state called the Rif Republic. They had a flag, they had a currency, they had a taxation system. So it was really a project of anti-colonial warfare and state building. He was, during the interwar years, he was a hero across the Islamic world. Newspapers from Indonesia to India to Egypt talked about his heroic deeds. After he surrendered to the French, they deport him to the Indian Ocean island of Réunion, where he lives with his family. By 1947, he's an elder man at this time. The French decided to relocate him to the Hexagon. They put him on a ship. And the ship has a layover in the Yemeni port of Aden. And informants of the Moroccans hear that the legendary Abd al-Karim is in Yemen. They inform the Moroccans about it. The Moroccans sent a delegation to the southern entrance of the Suez Canal. They wait for a ship to arrive, they board the ship, and during its journey through the Suez Canal, they manage to convince him to disembark at the northern exit of the Suez Canal. He does disembark, he arrives in Cairo to great acclaim. Everybody wants to be seen with him. It's just like weeks and weeks of just, everybody needs to be in his presence, and they need the journalists to talk about it and listen to his story of resistance. And overall, it just brings the Moroccan case to the attention of the Arabic public. I mean, this is such a big event. The New York Times and the London Times, everybody's reporting about it. Nonetheless, overall, the Moroccan campaign in Cairo is not very successful for a range of reasons, mainly that most Arabs are actually interested predominantly in the case of Palestine and the struggle against Zionism there. So sort of North Africa always seems of secondary importance. So there's a lot of public, claims of support for the North Africans, but there is very little actual political support by the Egyptian government or other Arab states. Then Egypt experiences its own military coup/revolution. The free officers take over, they end the monarchy, they turn Egypt into a republic that eventually embraces socialism and anti-imperialism, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the future second president of Egypt. And at first, in this moment of fervor, the the remnants of indirect British colonial control are finally over. Egypt is truly sovereign, and these new leaders are dedicated to anti-imperialism. Many Moroccans think this is the moment. Finally, the Egyptians are going to step up for us. But actually, the opposite happens. First of all, the new regime purges the old elites of the monarchy, whom they view as reactionary and corrupt. So many of these contexts of the social network that the Moroccans had been establishing in Egypt is just falling apart, depriving them of their pivotal social capital in the Arab world. Furthermore, the free officers are anti-monarchists. They view Arab monarchies as basically reactionary, anachronistic, and neo-feudal. And so the Moroccan attempts to create an independent constitutional monarchy doesn't really work for them. That is ideologically a completely different way of thinking. They view themselves as men of action, not this politicking and like handshaking and backroom dealing. And so actually, despite public statements to the contrary, they're actually not very supportive of the Moroccan struggle for independence, at least on the terms of the Moroccan nationalist parties. The Maktab al-Maghrib continues to exist until 1955. There are few Moroccans still active there, but overall, it is in the larger international campaign that the Moroccans conduct of limited importance. Let's move to the second of three places that I want to talk about, and that is Paris, the capital of the metropole. Now, in Paris, the French are just reestablishing democracy. It's the beginning of the Fourth Republic. The country is still suffering under wartime or post-wartime shortages. And of course, the Moroccans view this as a great moment to appeal directly to the public, to politicians, to decision makers in France, and convince them to grant Moroccan independence. Another reason why they increase their efforts in France is that the United Nations doesn't have a permanent home in Manhattan, the one that we all know, until 1952. So two of the UN General Assembly sessions actually take place in Paris, including the one in 1948 where the Declaration of Human Rights is adopted. So there's actually a second reason, right? They can directly lobby some of the diplomats coming to Paris. One of the first things that, in this case, it is the gentlemen from French Morocco that lead the charge. They send a delegation to Paris, among other things. They try to reach out to French journalists, politicians. It's sort of, they do have some success, but it's limited. And they do give a press conference. And I just want to read you an excerpt from that press conference because it really gives you a great insight into the way that they are, apologies about that, into their thinking. Quote, "The number of our friends in France has increased, and we have had success among all social classes. Even if it is exaggerated to claim that the French are united on the Moroccan question, we must try to achieve this because the Moroccan problem should interest all Frenchmen independent of their political preferences. It is not about opposing the legitimate interests of the French, but instead turning the French from unbearable masters, false protectors, into sincere friends, true advisors. The desire of His Majesty the Sultan to lead Morocco on the path of democracy and progress makes him a symbol of its unity, the defender of its interests, and the arbiter of its destiny." And the language here, I think, really gives us an insight into the thinking, into the way the Moroccans presented themselves, right? It's very, for lack of a better word, a very moderate tone they use. They're not anti-French. They want to be the friends of France, but as equals. They highlight that they want to maintain the monarchy, but it should be more as a symbol of unity. And that overall, right, it's for the lack of a better word, a moderate appeal to reach out to the French and hope for their understanding of their demands for independence. The Moroccan campaign in Paris now really heats up, and it is based on three buildings. First of all, the Foyer des Étudiants Marocains, which is the Moroccan student house in Paris, established by the Istiklal and the Moroccan monarch, who are paying for this. It's sort of a, it has housing, it provides meals, it has a library, studying opportunities, where Moroccan students who are already in the metropole can come together. But very quickly, many of these students become really fervent nationalists, and they turn the foyer into a hotbed of nationalist activism. The Istiklal also opens the Bureau des Documentations et des Informations du Parti de l'Istiklal, which, the name already gives it away. It's their official office in the center of Paris, close to the National Assembly, from where senior members of the Nationalist Party are trying to network among the elites of French society, mainly journalists, politicians, and just public intellectuals. And then thirdly, the Association Marocaine de Bienfaisance, the Moroccan Welfare Association, which they establish in a working class suburb of Paris. Now, at the end of the Second World War, there's a considerable Moroccan working class in the Paris metropolitan area, several thousand Moroccans. And the goal here is to reach out to them. So the Association is, again, like a community center. They provide basic health checkups. They provide Arabic classes for the children of immigrants. They have theater and entertainment for children. They have basic Islamic study classes. And they have community events. Most importantly, every November 18th, which is Throne Day, it's a nationalist holiday that the nationalists invent in the 1930s to celebrate the enthronement of Sultan Mohammed bin Yusuf. The entire community comes together. Usually they rent an event hall, and the events are usually attended by several thousand Moroccans, as well as some Algerians and Tunisians who are also interested, as well as several French sympathizers who go on stage. They give patriotic speeches, they sing patriotic songs. Some French people in French proclaim French-Moroccan unity, and some Istiklal members step up and, rally the working class to the cause of Moroccan nationalism. And these Moroccan students are very active in running the Association, in providing basic, welfare services, helping new arrivals find jobs, find homes, etc. So it's really an attempt of grassroots organizing of the Moroccan community. The Bureau also publishes a range of pamphlets, little booklets that lay out the claims, the goals of the nationalists, as well as important documents such as the Independence Manifesto that are then widely disseminated across mainly Paris and to a lesser degree France in general. Some of the prominent Frenchmen that come to support the Moroccans are Louis Massignon. He's a very prominent scholar of Islam, an outspoken Catholic, who shows up on Throne Day, at these rallies and reads in Arabic a message of love and peace, basically, for lack of a better word, between the French and Moroccan nations. Albert Camus himself does not attend one of the Throne Day rallies, but he sends a letter that is being read in which he hopes for a future in peace between the peoples of Morocco and France. So he doesn't call for Moroccan independence, but he lends his prestige to the Moroccan cause. Then a really pivotal moment in Moroccan colonial history happens, and those are the quote-unquote riots in the Carrière Centrale slum in Casablanca. In December 1952, French terrorists assassinate the prominent Tunisian labor leader, Ferhat Hached. And across North Africa, you see huge protests against the French in reaction, because Ferhat Hached is really prominent labor leader and nationalist. And these delve into clashes, let's put it politely, with the French authorities. The French army moves in, they open they open fire on the demonstrators, and they kill an untold number of Moroccans. In the aftermath, the French ban all nationalist parties, the nationalist press, and several Moroccan leaders have to move into exile. And they also claim the nationalists for the riots in the first place. And in this moment, the activists in Paris, they seize this tragic moment to really bring the cause of Moroccan independence to the attention of a wider French public. And in order to do so, they managed to recruit Francois Mauriac. They've been in contact with him for quite a while already. And Mauriac, at this very moment, is actually receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature. He's one of the most prominent Frenchmen of his age, famous writer, has a column in the media, and he's a Catholic. He's an outspoken Catholic. So a person like him is going to have an ability to convey their message to the wider French public that many of their more left-wing supporters could not. Mauriac returns to Stockholm. They sit down with him. They show him statistics of people that disappeared following the riots, that were killed. They give him specific numbers and ask him to speak up on their behalf. And Mauriac does so. And he writes in Le Figaro. And anybody who knows France knows it. Le Figaro is the leading conservative newspaper. And then he writes a series of articles on Morocco. And I'm just going to give you two excerpts. First, it is the obligation of all Christians of the French Union to force themselves to confront this racism born out of acquisitiveness and fear that leads to collective crimes. A few weeks later, he says, one should no longer think of certain young men of the Istiqlal as the enemies of France, but as interlocutors. This, of course, is a bombshell in French Morocco, that Francois Mauriac, of all people, denounces the protectorate and French colonial policies. And an American diplomat then describes this in an internal memo in the State Department as having opened or attacked a hornet's nest in French Morocco. Here's some of the reactions. The chief of the diplomatic cabinet writes, Mauriac has written without prudence and justice. The tabloid Paris writes about his, quote, monstrous statements. La Vigie Marocain finds it, quote, difficult to take Francois Mauriac seriously. And the reactionary Aspect de la France declares, the Sultan and the Istiqlal are no longer placing their hope on the UN or open rebellion, but on the thousands of Mauriacs willing to defame France. But there were also positive reactions from French North Africa. A friar in Algeria writes, your last article has profoundly moved me. This time I felt that the problem has been totally correctly understood and put in specifically Christian terms. I would like to thank you. Quote, humble Moroccan writes, thanks to your actions, we have all seen a glimmer of hope arise. We have cried of joy when we learned that you are not leaving us, you're not abandoning us. And another anonymous Moroccan writes, your article has been translated into Arabic in order to be well understood by all classes of Moroccans. So this is truly a huge PR success for the Moroccans. Mainstream French media is really discussing the Moroccan question with regard to substance and detail for several months. And many Frenchmen begin to agree that even if they personally might not immediately call for independence, they realize that probably something needs to happen. The Moroccan Sultan himself is also inspired by this and sends a photo of himself with a little dedication to Mauriac to express his thanks for his contribution to Franco-Moroccan friendship. Instead of me summarizing the achievements of the Moroccans, let me present to you an intelligence report written by a French officer that sort of tells you everything you need to know about the activities in France, written in June 1955, less than 1 year before Moroccan independence. The metropolitan representation of the Istiqlal managed to obtain an almost absolute unity among the Moroccan community in France. Predominantly composed of young persons of a quite high intellectual level, it is dynamic and displays a rather shrewd sense of politics. It has already achieved a few considerable results by knowing how to obtain important support in various sectors and among influential persons. It must be considered a significant instrument contributing to realizing the primary objective of the Istiqlal, the independence of Morocco. By the fall of 1955, the French National Assembly votes to form, quote, a Moroccan government capable of negotiating with France the necessary permanent bonds, which paves the way for the independence negotiations that half a year later, by March 1956, lead to Moroccan independence. And just very briefly pointing out, I'm not claiming that there is a monocausal explanation, right? That only this pressure campaign leads to Moroccan independence. There are several other factors. I'm pointing out that this is one of the important factors behind this decision. All right, finally, moving to the third location of Moroccan anti-colonial advocacy, or propaganda, as they call it themselves. Of course, they need to go to New York. That's the new capital of global diplomacy. And they choose Mehdi Bennouna, a member of a prominent nationalist family from Tétouan, from Spanish Morocco, who's one of the few Moroccans fluent in English. And so he goes on a one-man mission to the United Nations General Assembly. He arrives in New York, and it's truly astonishing. I mean, he meets all the Arab diplomats in Manhattan, and they carpool to go to the UN temporary headquarters in Queens. And back then, apparently, it was really easy to just waltz into the building without any official accreditation and just talk to other diplomats. And he's very successful. I have his diary, so he details whom he talks to, whom he meets. People are very sympathetic. But it also becomes obvious to him that sort of putting the Moroccan question on the official UN agenda is going to take a lot of time and effort. He nonetheless manages to get a lot of media coverage. The New York Times itself, has 3 articles about him. He appears on radio. He appears in all kinds of outlets. The Pakistan's foreign minister, Zafrullah Khan, is perhaps his biggest supporter. His other main mentor in New York is Azam Basha, the Secretary General of the Arab League. Towards the end of his stay, here we see him at the very far right in the fashionable pinstripe suit with the Arab diplomats. This is a photo taken right before the UNGA vote on the division of Palestine. And he really had hoped that the Arabs would, on his behalf, lobby other delegations to put the Moroccan question on the agenda. The Arab diplomats are really more concerned about preventing the partition of Palestine. We all know they do not succeed. And so the Moroccan question has to go on the back burner. And Bennouna realizes that on the one hand, it's very much possible to be successful in New York, but the Moroccans need more manpower, more knowledge, and a more organized campaign in the future. So he returns back to Tangier, stays there for a while he and his colleagues are trying to figure out what their next steps will be. And in this moment, in 1949, a truly unique historical character appears on the scene. His name is Rom Landau. He's a British citizen of Polish origin. He's a truly, let's put it this way, queer character. His interest, he has written a lot of books. He's written about spirituality, the plastic arts, and human sexuality. He comes to Morocco to write a travel book about Morocco, but as soon as he arrives in Tangier, the Moroccan nationalists meet with him, they tell him about Morocco, and they arrange an audience with the Sultan. So Landau meets the Sultan, he meets the Crown Prince, and he falls in love with Morocco. He goes back to Britain and publishes a number of articles on Morocco, talking about the independence question in the British press. He comes back again in 1950, and again meets prominent nationalists, again meets the king in a private audience, and basically at this moment decides to dedicate his life to Moroccan independence. He's a very, he's very much has an Orientalist mindset, and has this very romantic vision of Morocco. Now, his efforts are really appreciated by the Moroccans. In the words of the prominent leader Al-Fassi, I can also let you know that your Moroccan friends are not forgetting you and cannot forget you. Honorable persons like you ingrain themselves in the memories of people as grateful as the Moroccans. Your actions on behalf of their country reminds them of you all the time. During his second return to Morocco, he's actually featured on the front page of the nationalist press in this, I would say, pretty awkward Lawrence of Arabia outfit, but it sort of gives you sort of an insight into his, relationship to the Muslim world. Now, he returns for a third time to Morocco, to Tangier, but this time the French and Spanish authorities decide to not allow him to enter their respective zones. I mean, they're realizing, it's not working well for them. And so the Moroccan nationalists ask him to travel to the US and, reach out to Americans and tell them about Moroccan independence. He goes to the United States accompanied by Mohammed Laghzawi, a prominent nationalist, maybe Morocco's leading Muslim capitalist who tries to leave Morocco because he's afraid of being arrested by the French. They go there, and then Landau does a one-man show. He meets Secretary of State. He talks before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He talks at the CIA. He talks at the State Department. He talks at multiple Ivy League universities. Talks on radio stations. Back then, apparently, it was much easier. The national security state and the whole DC plus X or Acela corridor nexus is just being established. So an outsider without any credentials can just waltz in and convince people that he has something to say. And apparently he's it goes very well, but he returns back home and tells the Moroccans more is needed. They need to start a more concerted effort to bring their case to American attention. And the Moroccans do that. They establish the Moroccan Office of Information and Documentation in New York in the fall of 52. Several prominent members of the Istiqlal, as well as a few members of the PNR from Spanish Morocco, including Mehdi Bennouna, who's returning, are running this. And this is similar to its, counterpart in Paris. The official headquarters of the Moroccans, from where they reach out to diplomats at the United Nations, to journalists, to figures of American public life. And I really like this image where several Moroccans are, joining several UN diplomats from around the world at some get-together in Manhattan. Landau publishes on behalf of the Moroccans, including the book The Sultan of Morocco, which is basically hagiography, containing sentences such as, "Those who had been in personal touch with Mohammed V were very much impressed by his sagacity, diplomatic skill, and talent for moderation." And the Moroccans are handing out copies of this book left and right. Even more importantly, they start to publish newsletters, especially Free Morocco, which is really well produced. It contains articles appealing to an American public. Basically, the main themes are Moroccans want independence, but we want to be friends of the West. We are not communists. We are not fanatics. And if Morocco becomes independent, the global capitalist system will benefit from our contributions, right? So it's not a radical break with the status quo of a hierarchical global system, but Moroccans are trying to find their spot as a junior partner in the global geopolitical hierarchy. Landau in the beginning is the editor, helps them to write proper English and to appeal to American audiences. According to French observers, allegedly the Moroccans produce 100,000 copies of each issue of Free Morocco. That seems like a very large number, but there's several sources that confirm this. And they just send it out for free to anybody who wants it, and even those who don't want it. And so still today, I think the Cornell University Library, University of Wisconsin Library, for example, they still have their copies of Morocco if you ever are there and want to check one out yourself. By December 1952, all the leaders of all the four Moroccan nationalist parties join hands in New York in order to do a final lobbying push in the UN headquarters to put the Moroccan question on the agenda. Now, the resolution they achieve is sort of partially disappointing. It declares, well, it expresses the confidence that the government of France will endeavor to further the fundamental liberties of the people of Morocco in conformity with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Many Moroccan nationalists are disappointed. They wanted a clear support for Moroccan independence. But a few weeks later, they start to realize this is actually an amazing achievement for third world non-state actors to even put their case on the agenda of the UN in the first place. And so they decide to actually escalate their efforts in New York. Some of the many prominent Americans they draw to their side are First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who's a really prominent figure of public life. Landau meets her twice and convinces her to dedicate 2 of her weekly press columns to the Moroccan case, which she does. Even an even bigger publicity stunt is that they managed to recruit Supreme Court Judge William O. Douglas during several personal meetings. And William Douglas he's a superstar. I mean, he's married. I don't know how often he was married, but every time the women he's married to are more beautiful and younger. So he's sort of like, yeah, he's really a celebrity. He travels the world. The media is covering him all the time. So he's not like what you think of as a Supreme Court justice in the 21st century. And they convince him of their cause, and he travels to Morocco. And upon his return, he publishes an article in Look magazine in which he lambasts the French, writing, "The Moors are the serfs. The French have not only practiced discrimination, they have built an economy based on discrimination. Racism is rampant in Morocco. Parisians would be shocked to know that public toilets are often segregated. The French know how to use terror in Morocco. It is part and parcel of their political tactics. All colonialism must come to an end. All colonies must be liquidated." And for the French, in the French embassy in Washington, D.C., this is an absolute shock. Like this, it really hits them like a bombshell and indicates the success the Moroccans have at networking with prominent Americans and have them speak out on their behalf to bring their message to public attention. Now, the French try to do a counter initiative. They recruit a Moroccan that supports colonialism, Mohammed bin Muqtatem Samani, who travels across the United States. He appears on radio. He basically does what the Moroccans do, but in reverse. There are even some debates between him and some Moroccans, as well as the American supporters. But ultimately, he has to realize that his efforts are not going to be enough to stop the campaign of the Moroccan nationalists. As he writes in 1955, the most active office of the nationalists is the one in Paris, but the most influential one is currently the one in the US, which is specifically charged with following the solution of the Moroccan question at the UN and conducting vast propaganda among the Americans to make them understand that the independence of Morocco is necessary for world peace. In other words, he throws in the towel and realizes he has no chance to counteract the successful networking of the nationalists in North America. Rom Landau now leaves the MOAD. He basically hits the public speaking circuit, travels across the country to civic associations, women's clubs, book clubs, universities, think tanks, and talks about the Moroccan question. And he becomes a professor of North African studies at the College of the Pacific in San Francisco in 1954. A few other Americans very important in supporting the Moroccan independence struggle are, among others, Irving Brown. He is a representative of the American Federation of Labor, which back then had a foreign policy. He's based in Paris, and his job is to support so-called free trade unions across the world, i.e. non-communist trade unions, including potential trade unions being established in French North Africa. Now, Moroccans have been trying to organize an independent Moroccan Muslim labor union associated with the Istiqlal Independence Party since the Second World War, but they hadn't been allowed to do so. And Irving Brown uses his clout in Paris to lobby for the release to some of the union leaders. He gets them out of prison, and he actually gets the French government in the spring of 1955 to grant the Moroccans the right to unionize. So it's not like he creates the union, but he is really influential in, pressuring the French government to actually allow these rights in the first place. In hindsight, later on, it becomes obvious that he's actually financed by the CAA and the AFL. The CAA, the American state in general, are sort of organizing an anti-communist campaign. And their goal is to get France out of North Africa and make sure that North Africa doesn't, quote unquote, fall into the hands of the communists. The AFL and other members of the AFL, I want to briefly point out, also regularly publish articles in Free Morocco. So the connection is really across the Atlantic. Furthermore, American businessmen, these are usually former US Army officers that after the Second World War returned to Morocco to engage in import-export business. And they benefit from a loophole, namely that the French authorities cannot apply certain regulations to US citizens. These are laws that, the Sultan of Morocco had granted to the Americans certain privileges before the protectorate, and they were technically still active. So they can sort of, import-export goods, and they don't have to, and import-export dollars, other merchants can. Now, in 47, the French see through this, and they put an end to these privileges. And then the American businessmen, led by Major Robert E. Rhodes, go to Washington, D.C. and start a lobbying campaign on Capitol Hill to punish France for its policies. Robert E. Rhodes works very closely with the Moroccans at the MOID New York. He also writes articles. His wife writes articles in Free Morocco. Ultimately, he is successful, and the Senate passes the Hickenlooper Amendment, which punishes France and withholds Marshall Plan aid unless the privileges of the American businessmen are reinstated. Ultimately, the whole case ends up in front of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which renders sort of a in-between verdict, rendering nobody fully happy. But for the Moroccan nationalists, this is a huge event because in their eyes, the details are not important. What is important here is that the International Court of Justice basically agreed that Moroccan sovereignty exists and that pre-colonial treaties still have some validity. A more important link is with Kenneth Pendar, a former OSS, Army Intelligence Officer during the war. He also returns to Morocco and opens a Coca-Cola bottling plant. Now, this bottling plant is fascinating because half the board members are Moroccan nationalists. The Moroccan royal family is major investor. Pendar himself becomes a major advertiser in the nationalist press. I present you some ads here. The French authorities see through this weird connection between the businessmen and the nationalists, and they spread the rumor that Coca-Cola contains pork, thus bringing its sales to complete halt. But surprisingly, members of the family start drinking Coca-Cola in public, thus allowing it to regain its market share. An unsympathetic French observer once declared Coca-Cola the drink of the Moroccan patriot. Now, Kenneth Pendar also provides logistical support, transferring funds to New York and back. He actually participates at a discussion about Morocco in Washington, D.C., defending the Moroccan case for independence. There's no evidence that he works for the CIA, but as a former intelligence officer, he has very close relationships to the CIA, to the American state, and sort of shows this, nexus of the beginning of the American national security state as, the waspy elites, the slippery slope between business, between national interests, between anti-communist interests. They all intersect here, and the Moroccans obviously benefit from it quite greatly. All right. Finally, the home stretch. Morocco is independent in March 56. And King Mohammed V will now succeed in turning the country basically into his kingdom, becoming the arbiter, the commander of the faithful, the ultimate arbiter that's going to rule and whose descendants are going to rule the country. He does so by co-opting the central nodes of the Moroccan network. And I'll show you the graph again in a few seconds, by drawing many of these people who ran the offices in Paris, in New York, and making them work for him, making them for example, Mehdi Ben Nouna becomes the spokesman for the royal family. Ahmed Alawi, who had run the Paris office, becomes the press secretary of the royal family. Mehdi Ben Aboud, who had founded the MOID in New York, becomes the first ambassador to the United States. Mohamed Larzawi, the capitalist who had traveled to New York in 51, or rather to Virginia in 51, becomes head of national security, et cetera, et cetera. So he draws the social capital these people had acquired into his orbit, that's weakening the nationalist parties. And the PNR and the Istiqlal merge into one party just called the Istiqlal. The crowning achievement is his sort of the victory lap, is his visit to the United States in 1957, in November, December. He meets with Secretary of State. It was a big state dinner. During this state dinner, the Moroccans insist that Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas is invited. They insist that a representative of Coca-Cola is invited. Kenneth Pendar accompanies Mohammed V on his flight to New York, to Washington, D.C., to Andrews Air Force Base. He also he does a lot of PR. He goes to Bronx Zoo. He goes to Disneyland. He goes to the Met Opera. At the Met, Eleanor Roosevelt sits with his daughters in the audience, symbolizing the strong link between the Roosevelt family and the Moroccan state. He's at the Lawrence Laboratory in California. And then he insists on visiting the College of the Pacific in San Francisco, to the dismay of the head of protocol in the State Department, who doesn't really get why a king would want to visit what he considers a pretty obscure institution of higher learning. But we, of course, know what he wants. He wants to draw Rom Landau into his orbit. He shows up and he gives a speech at the college, quote, in which he thanks, quote, Rom Landau for what he has done, standing by our side in our most difficult days. Rom Landau retires from his job in 1968, relocates to Marrakesh, where he, lives in a fancy villa, that's at least how he describes it, granted to him by the royal family until he dies less than 10 years later. Irving Brown continues to visit North Africa after independence. A person who met him once told me he always traveled with a suitcase filled with cash to support labor unions that were anti-communist. After independence, several additional labor unions are founded in Morocco, and he supports the Istiqlal-affiliated UMT because it's not left-wing, and hopes to weaken the left-wing affiliated labor unions. The Coca-Cola bottling plant in Casablanca continues to be its most important one in Africa. And the relationship between the Moroccan state and Coca-Cola continues to be strong. Kenneth Pandar is very closely intertwined with the inner circle of the royal palace. I would argue he is one of the direct links that the royals have to the, CIA, to the nexus of Beltway, as well as to major business elites in the United States. And Kenneth Pandar remains in Morocco until he dies in the 70s. The relationship to Egypt, however, during this period is very cool, contrary to what these images might suggest, because the Moroccans really are very upset still by the lack of support that they received from the revolutionary regime. Of course, from Nasser's perspective, like I mentioned before, any type of monarchy is reactionary and feudal, so that's not really his cup of tea. So the relationship, Morocco doesn't join the Arab League until 2.5 years after independence, which is sort of, it's really almost an insult to Egypt, and they only join when it really is no longer avoidable. Finally, visualizations, again, as I promised, right? So here we can see some of these names I've mentioned, prominent members of the Istiqlal or of the nationalist movement in general, in red, and we see the location in this visualization is irrelevant. All that matters is the size of each node, which indicates in between a centrality. That's one way we measure the centrality of a node within a network and how easily it can access resources / social capital within the network. And we see that Mohammed bin Yusuf on the eve of independence is marginal within this network. However, he manages to co-opt, to recruit the central players within this network, draw them to his side, strengthen his position, weaken the Istiqlal, and we see that by the dramatic increase in the size of his node here, and now he has the access to the social capital presented A, by the Moroccans who've been active abroad, and B, by their foreign contacts, whom he draws to his side, including Eleanor Roosevelt, including William Douglas, including Irving Brown, including Francois Mauriac, whom he actually visits in Paris. Didn't get into that. And thereby, I argue, contributing to the strength of the monarchy after independence. And so finally, just to summarize the key findings and also explain very briefly how does it fit into the literature, because I assume most of you are not familiar with the scholarship on colonial Morocco. First of all, the structure of the nationalist global anti-colonial advocacy network both made their success possible and led to their demise after March 56. The international arena played a pivotal role in the Moroccan struggle for independence. I'm not claiming that domestic events are irrelevant, but hitherto the scholarship is only on what happened inside Morocco, and I argue that the international activities are just as important for understanding the Moroccan struggle for independence. Third of all, the scholarship on colonial Morocco usually treats French and Spanish Morocco separately. A book is either on one or the other, and I show that we cannot understand them as separately because it was one history, despite the differences between the protectorates that I will acknowledge. And then finally, the groundwork for Morocco's close relationship with with the US after independence was laid during the independence struggle. For a range of reasons, among them the positive feedback, the positive experiences the Moroccans had, the support they obtained from many Americans during the struggle for independence, even if the US government wasn't really outspoken on behalf of Morocco. And I really think that this shaped the perception of the United States among the Moroccan political elites after independence. So 50 minutes. I hope you could follow me along and I didn't put you to sleep, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stenner, for a very interesting presentation. I'm sure I learned a lot, and hopefully the audience also learned a lot. If you have questions, you can type them or you can raise your hands and be allowed to unmute yourself and speak. What struck me during your presentation was the similarities between the Moroccan struggle and the sub-Saharan activists in Paris during that time period. And I was just wondering if you came across Moroccans, and in your research, did it come up like when they were collaborating? I also noticed their appeal to the French intellectuals. So that sounded familiar to me. So I was just wondering, were there some collaboration, some networks between North Africans and Sub-Saharan Africans?
Great question. So based on all the primary sources I worked through, it is obviously I can't say non-existent, but negligible. So my knowledge about Sub-Saharan African activists, especially in interwar Paris, etc., is from the literature that I've read. But in my actual sources, I cannot recall a single source talking about Moroccans actively or indirectly, to say, meeting with somebody from French West Africa. I'm not saying they never ran into each other, but they weren't really their target. I mean, these countries weren't independent yet, right? So they didn't really have much to offer to the Moroccans. They couldn't, they didn't have a vote at the UN. And so their target was really the French public. And the people they cooperated with were other North Africans in Paris. And even that, they worked with them, but on a more limited scale than one might assume. It was really, we focus on ourselves, we do our thing. If the Tunisians or Algerians want to, share some resources here and there, we'll do it. But overwhelming was like, we can do this ourselves. And whom we really need are Frenchmen, because, to appeal to French mainstream society, we don't need a Francophone intellectual from West Africa. We need a white Catholic who has a reputation in the country. So I think there's a certain, very strategic choice there. And yeah, so the long answer to a very straightforward question, the links to sub-Saharan African activists are almost non-existent in the sources that I worked through.
Thank you. And you have questions, I would read them to you, but it might be better if you read them.
All right, I will do so. The first one is very long, so give me 10 seconds to skim it, and then I will give you an answer. Well, that's a great question. The first question, for those who haven't read it, is basically about contemporary French-Moroccan relations, which are a little bit bumpy. Now, I'm not a political scientist working on contemporary Moroccan politics. I want to put that out there, but of course, as a historian of politics, I still sort of have a basic understanding of what's going on. So, this is, so you have to keep that in mind. Historically, France and Morocco had very close relations. Basically, since the end of independence, they got along extremely well. Things have really changed since the Abraham Accords, that must have been 2020, I think, right? The last year of the Trump administration, where, for those who are not aware of it, basically the Trump did sort of like a 19th century imperialist deal, where several Arab states accept Israel. In return, they get sort of Israeli spyware to spy on their opposition politicians. Morocco just gets the Western Sahara officially recognized, which the most diplomatic, officially by international law, it's a disputed territory that the Moroccans claim as part of their country. And every Moroccan I know will say there is no claim, this is ours. But internationally, it's still, the UN demands that there'll be a referendum over the Western Sahara to find out whether there should be, the territory should be granted autonomy. And the French usually, didn't really care much about it. But ever since the Abrahams Accord, ever since, they basically made this deal, you basically, Israel, you can do whatever you want with all the territories you want. And then the Moroccans, you just get like the Western Sahara, it's all good. The Moroccans are just like Western Sahara all the way. Now it's just like, if you do not recognize it, if you do not basically swear absolute acceptance and fealty to the Western Sahara as part of Morocco, as a Western nation, it's completely unacceptable. And the French are not willing to go that far. And that seems to be the main reason for the complicated relationship at the moment. I'm not saying that's the only factor, but that is the main factor. And of course, the other thing is about contemporary politics. Morocco and France is, the French are obsessed with, one of the words I really hate, but like stability in North Africa. They don't want terrorist groups, right? Plus, they don't want migrants to come across the Mediterranean. And Morocco uses migration as a policy tool. So there are two Spanish enclaves in Morocco, where I'm sure all of you know that, Ceuta and Melilla, where mainly sub-Saharan Africans, but also Moroccans try to reach Spain and then maybe also go to France. And Morocco uses that. Whenever Moroccan elites are angry by Europeans, they just let migrants just climb the walls into Ceuta and Melilla. And when they're happy, they reduce that. So one of the points I'm trying to make here is that for France, basically outsourcing migration control to the other side of the Mediterranean, which is basically the official policy of the European Union, is one of the reasons why the French don't really want to run afoul of the Moroccans. So there's more to say, but I'll leave it at that. Second question. It's about the penal code of Morocco. I mean, that's a great question. I have to admit, I'm not an expert on law in contemporary Morocco. The one aspect of law that I'm most familiar with is not the penal code, but it's a family law. And after independence, there's actually a great book written about that. It's called States and Women's Rights. And it looks at the family law adopted by Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco after independence during the period of state formation, and how it is the result of different political groups, the struggle for power and influence. What happens in Morocco is that Morocco adopts, of all three former French colonies, the most, let's put it, conservative family code, which is based on it's not the Sharia as interpreted in the 18th century. It's sort of a modernized, reinterpreted Sharia, which nonetheless puts more emphasis, women and men are not treated equally. Polygamy is allowed. Women, I think, are allowed to marry at 14 back then. These things have been adjusted. The Mudawana, the family code, has been adjusted about a decade ago. So what I'm saying is not contemporary anymore, but it is largely based on, again, not, just taking Islamic law from the 18th century, but it's sort of a modernized version. And the reason for that with regard to Morocco is that the Moroccan Sultan, Moroccan king, takes his power from an alliance with the tribal elites in the countryside to outmaneuver the nationalists, who are basically urban elites, right? That's sort of another major reason for his victory. That's sort of established by other scholars, and I'm building off of that. And by establishing a conservative Islamic-based family code, he allows the patrilineal relations and kinship groups that tribes are based on to continue to persist in the modern Moroccan state. So that's what I can say. I'm kind of sorry you asked for A. I answer B, but I hope it gives you a part insight. And then when it comes to the actual penal code, I have to admit, I'm not competent enough to speak with authority in front of an audience of fellow scholars. Other questions? if the political system in France and Spain influenced the independence of Morocco is the question. Well, yes, of course. So the short, well, it's not actually going to be short, but I'm trying to keep it short, right? France is, of course, a republic. It's a democratic system. So public opinion actually matters. Another main factor for why France actually relinquishes its control over Morocco is the outbreak of the Algerian Revolution in 1954. And so amidst this war, the French are realizing maybe we should focus all our energies on keeping Algeria. Algeria is part of France. It's French territory, whereas Morocco is a protectorate. There's a treaty established in 1912 that clearly says that France is there to, quote unquote, establish order, basically, sort of League of Nations, liberal imperialism, until the Moroccans are able to stand on their own feet. I'm paraphrasing here. So there's always an understanding Morocco will be independent one day. And of course, the French are always like, oh, one day. But there is, like, law actually matters. And Algeria is completely different. There's no negotiation. Algeria is French. It'll never be not French. And sort of as the revolution breaks out, that really makes French politicians reconsider the hold on Morocco, saying, is that really necessary? Should we waste more energy here? There's a popular protest movement. There's all this international publicity against it. All of it is coming together. And so to go back to the question, yes, I think the democratic system, the public engagement, that people like Moya can speak out, and it really becomes an agenda in the National Assembly based on what he says, is really influential. Spain, of course, is not a democracy, but a military dictatorship under Francisco Franco. And the reason why Spain leaves the Spanish protectorate is abolished 2-3 weeks, don't quote me on it, after the end of the French protectorate, for a very simple reason. The Spanish protectorate was granted to Spain as a sublease. When in 1912, the French established the protectorate, they write the Treaty of Fez, colloquially put, the Spanish are always on their case, like, oh, we want a colony. The Spanish have really lost their last colonies in the New World, in the Philippines, in the 1898 war. And they, prestige, they want a colony. And the French basically just say, all right, you can have this northern strip, like we're in the mountains, there isn't much going on from our perspective. If you take this and you leave us alone, okay? We get to keep the rest. And the Spanish say, that's a great deal. And so into the Spanish-Moroccan treaty is written as a clause into the Treaty of Fez. So this is why a Moroccan scholar I once talked to, he pointed this out to me. He says it's sort of a sublease. They sublease northern Morocco to the Spaniards. And so this is why the propaganda campaign or the advocacy campaign of the nationalists is not really directed against Spain that much. They don't talk about it because they know what matters. They know that if the French cancel the protectorate treaty, basically automatically the Spanish sublease is also canceled. So it's not really the Spanish political system so much as the legal text that the protectorate is based upon in the first place that leads in this case to the fact that both protectorates collapse within the same month. Another question. Oh, there's a question, development. Oh, that's a broad question. Let me think if I actually have an answer for that. The question is, development of Africa, what place do I have to give to West Francophone Africa? There are multiple ways to answer it. If it is about, the political development of, the African continent in general, etc., I would say I'm not especially talking at an African Studies Center. I'm not even going to start talking about this because I'm not qualified to answer that question. I'm going to give you a partial answer by going back to Morocco and the relationship between Morocco and the African states. I talk about in my book at the very end, very briefly. So I'm not a specialist, but I think it's in the afterword. I talk about the Moroccan Cold War policy and the Casablanca Conference of, you already caught me, I don't even know the exact date, I think it's 1960, brings together all kinds of African nations, especially in Mohammed V. He really is like, Mohammed V's foreign policy is pro-American, pro-French neutrality, right? He's sympathetic to sort of what will soon become the non-aligned movement and the idea of neutrality, but he also is very comfortable with the Western powers and situates himself there very much but also tries to reach out to the African nations, which are just beginning to become independent, by the way, right? And then under Hassan II, whose successor in 61, he really takes a radical pro-Western. He establishes Morocco as a junior partner in the Western camp during the Cold War, and that's the main foreign policy. And it's really been, to jump forward to contemporary days, I'm not saying Morocco had no engagement with sub-Saharan Africa, but it really has been in the last 15 years or so that it become part of Moroccan foreign policy to engage with sub-Saharan Africa. The king travels to sub-Saharan African countries, major diplomats are there, always accompanied by Moroccan businesses, which always try to set up shop across sub-Saharan Africa. Sort of a really coherent diplomatic, economic campaign across all of Africa really becomes only part of the Moroccan foreign policy repertoire under the current king during, about the last 15 years. It has changed quite dramatically from the Cold War era. Question, I see a hand.
Yeah, I'm gonna allow this one to do. D. Keita, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. It's not unmuted.
Question for David.
Hmm?
So now, what can be done to fight against neocolonialism in Morocco?
Neocolonialism where?
In Morocco.
In Morocco.
Yes.
That's a great question. That's sort of the kind of thing I sometimes try to talk with my students about at the end of the semester. But I mean, I'm going to try to come up with the way I think about it, right? So on the one hand, within the realms of sovereign nation states, I would say that Morocco is pretty much a sovereign nation state that does almost all of its domestic and foreign policy from the perspective, from its own interests. And by its own interests, I would like to say from the interests of the ruling elites associated with the royal palace. I'm not saying, when I don't like the phrase national interest, which sort of implies as if all people in a country have the same interest of the state leaders, which I don't believe in, but sort of what the policymakers, the people of the royal palace believe is in their interest. And Moroccans are very self-confident for an African nation. Like I said, they used migration, and you might say it's pretty inhumane to do that, and I would agree with you, but that's one of the tools they have at their disposal. They use the access to fishing rights, with the EU trawlers want to come to Africa and just, empty all the West African coast. You have cheap fish in Europe and, bankrupt all the African fishermen. But the Moroccan state is strong enough to exert concessions and say, you can do that, but you got to pay us for it. The extreme aggressive attitude vis-a-vis the French, the West Saharan issue shows their confidence as well. Of course, overall, the Moroccan elites are just also ideologically closely aligned with the West. So when Morocco adopts policies like, anti-terrorism, I'm not saying there's no terrorism, but, like this sort of war on terror, the Moroccans are all in. The US, the CIA had tortured dark sides of Morocco. We were like very, very close with the Moroccans. And it's sort of like a dark gray zone. Students ask, like, is that neocolonialism or not? On the one hand, yes. Right. But at the same time, I think the Moroccan elites very self-consciously, they welcome that. They view themselves as benefiting from it. I think the larger realm, like the biggest issue is sort of the economic dependency Morocco has on Western countries, which is, of course, the case for every former colony, for every African colony, right? That, you can do whatever you want. And I'm not saying, I'm not uncritically accepting Immanuel Wallerstein's, world system, from the 1970s, a little bit more complex than that. But the underlying idea I definitely buy into, that still, the African former colonies mainly contribute resources, and the value is added in Europe and then being re-exported to North Africa. So again, how exactly to do that? The large, given the failure of the non-aligned movement of the G77, I don't have any. I have some ideals of how it should work, but I don't have any concrete ways of how the real world could actually work to sort of overcome the Western economic dominance, which I would argue is at the heart of neo-colonial relations. But Morocco always, I'm not saying Moroccans are only think about themselves. It sounds very negatively, but they do have now an economic, like a manufacturing policy. For example, they settle Renault, the French car manufacturer, has production factories. They're not, they come to Morocco, they assemble cars, which are then sold in all of Africa, and in Europe. So they actually have begun to bring some manufacturing bases to North Africa, which of course is still not enough, but it is more, again, because of their location, because of the infrastructure, because of their close relations to France, are able to sort of benefit from this. And I'm not saying they're creating an independent economy on par with Europe, but they're sort of trying to carve out these positions where they can at least become semi-independent from Western colonial dominance. So again, an answer about Morocco, Moroccan past, Moroccan present. But regrettably, I can't give you a grand a vision that I have that is in any way, shape, or form realistic of overcoming the very real neo-colonial relations between Western powers and African nations.
Any other questions or comments? So I think you did it, David. Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming and sharing your research with us. Have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you, audience, for being here and for asking questions. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.